Hello and welcome to the Epitome. I'm your host, Nathan Bozeman. Today I'm joined with my friends, Dr. James Agnew and Adam Terry from Curious Christianity. How are you guys doing today?
Doing good. I was vibing to that intro music. It was like, it's pretty chill. It's a good one to start the thing to.
Adam was the only one not dancing, so I'm going to, just call him out for that. Me and James were dancing.
Oh, well.
Thanks. See, I couldn't see you, but
I could see both of you guys, and Adam was not dancing, but you and I were.
Yeah.
So today we're here to talk about a very interesting conversation. So, Dr. James, you just gave your dissertation on Kenotic Christology. So that's going to be a mouthful for a lot of our viewers. Could you first of all just explain what that is and, what got you into this topic?
Yeah, I just gave my dissertation or turned that in like 6-ish months ago. So just as like a bit of a stretch, but yeah. So the idea of Kenotic Christology, put simply, is the idea that like Christ empties himself of something when he becomes incarnate, and we'll get a little bit more into that later. But yeah, so I got interested in this because actually I first got interested in this and started going down this rabbit hole when I was doing some. I was still putting out a lot of content on TikTok, and I was engaging with a lot of Muslims, and Muslims like to go to the like, oh, Jesus didn't know the day or hour, or like, aha, he's not God, he didn't know something. And at that point, I was kind of just regurgitating answers that guys like William Lane Craig have given, and then I was listening to like a William Lane Craig podcast or Reasonable Faith something or other, and like, or maybe I was reading a paper by him or something, and he was defending his view of the Trinity, and I was like, but wait a second, like I can take this view of the Trinity that you just articulated, the defense you just gave, and I can just do that with Kenotic Christology, and that'll work. And then so I sent in a question of the week to Craig, and I pressed him on this. I'm like, there's some inconsistency, and they responded. They chose my question of the week to do the thing to, and they responded, and I saw it, and I was like, oh, this is not a good response. Like, you didn't actually get out of this problem. You didn't dodge this. And so that kind of like lit a fire, So I was it was about that time that I was looking at doing a doctoral program. I was thinking about dissertations, and then so I had like several dissertation topics, and I kind of narrowed it down and decided to go with this one. And then now I'm like, Kenotic Christology is a pretty small. I think it's a pretty small world as far as like the scholars who are at least like up and like talking about it and putting out stuff on it. So I guess I am now one.
So Christ emptied himself in the incarnation, and I guess I can totally understand why what got you into it was like, I think I owned Dr. William Lane Craig here. Like, let's go. I think that's a good motivating factor. And before we get started into your presentation and talking more, Adam, could you introduce yourself, friend of the channel, tell a little bit about yourself to the people?
Yep, I'm Adam, and I run Curious Christianity. And so, look, really always interested in biblical truths and asking the questions sometimes other people aren't asking. And I think this is a really interesting subject that hasn't been thought about enough by some people. And I'll just definitely express, like, when I run across questions or objections or different doctrines, and you ask a question of the teacher, and the teacher gives you the answer, and you're like, yeah, that doesn't work. So it definitely inspires me as well. So I think this will be a good conversation, and it's a good topic. It's a good topic that I think could be further developed.
I will say also, just before we hop in, that the things we're going to talk about today and my dissertation is available available in my book, but there's a free ebook of this available right now. So if you are like me and you prefer ebooks, like, you can get the ebook version of my book, What Jesus Didn't Know. Oh, does he have it? Is it on the shelf? Is it there? Oh,
it's right here.
Oh, dang, there it is. Yeah. So if anybody's like halfway through this and they're like, I want to know more, I want to get more deets.
Just throw it on the floor now.
Yeah, it's on Amazon. Yeah.
It was really good as well. That's why it's on my shelf. I like to have like the books that I like a lot back here. So, I have like lots of books like on top of the shelf and in other places, but yours made the shelf. All right. So I enjoyed the book a lot. And in fact, I haven't thought a lot about Kenotic Christology before reading this book. This was like my almost introduction to it. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is I think that a lot of the concerns that I would have is actually the topic of your dissertation, because you were specifically dealing with a argument called the essential attributes argument, where it was like, how can Jesus be God but also empty himself and not have either omniscience or even omnipotence? And that would be my initial concern. Like when I first heard of Kenotic Christology, I was like, okay, well, how is he God? And so you answered that question, I think, pretty convincingly, in my opinion. I think the answer you give is, I was like, wow, that's first of all, really creative way of answering it. But also I thought it was like, yeah, I don't see how this is a problem anymore. So.
Yeah, and to clarify, like the main goal of my dissertation was to argue that like this objection doesn't work, essentially, like the essential attributes objection, which we'll get more into that. The goal of my dissertation wasn't to be like everyone should be a Kenotic Christology proponent. Like I put some arguments in there, right? I have some arguments in there, probably two, about like here are some really big reasons where maybe you would want to consider this and it's going to hit. But that wasn't the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal was to be like, this is not deserving of the flack that it gets. This is not deserving of like this objection doesn't go through. So it's essentially me kind of clearing the path for if like people want to hold to Kenotic Christology. I'm going to say, yeah, you can do that, and you can do it without being being told you're denying the deity of Christ or something like that.
And what's interesting is, if I'm understanding your conclusion correctly, you would still say that Jesus in the incarnation is both omniscient and omnipotent, but he, in some ways, I guess, laid down those properties either way. So he kind of like at the same time has both, but it's not a contradiction. So that's going to be fun to talk about.
Potentially, yeah. I would want to nuance that, but we can wait into the section of my presentation where I get to that before I'll dive into that.
I'm trying not to give away too much. I don't want them to know what the answer is until we get to it. So it's an interesting thing to think about and how to word it. But yes, also before we get into his presentation, both of these guys have great YouTube channels. Go subscribe to them. I'm going to put it in a link in the description below. Without further ado, James, let's get into your presentation on what Jesus didn't know. Take it away.
Awesome. Okay, so what Jesus didn't know is the title of my book, and that's the title of the presentation, A Defense of Kenotic Christology. What is Kenotic Christology? Already talked about this a bit. So it's the idea when Jesus became incarnate, he emptied himself of certain knowledge or abilities or both or something along those lines. How this gets cashed out is going to be a bit different depending on like the author. So you have some people who are like, he gave up omnipotence. You have some people who say like, he gave up like the use of his omnipotence or something like that. You do have some people in churches and Christian history who are like, he gave up his divinity, but like that's kind of one of the common caricatures of Kenotic Christology is like, that's the position, Jesus stopped being God. Like that is not the what I would say the traditional main presentation of Kenotic Christology. And kind of one of the main founder, or the guy who kind of got the ball rolling with this, how is pronounced? His name is Gottfried, I think Thomasius or Thomasius. It's like a German name. So if somebody's like watching this and they're like, you butchered that, my apologies. But he's emphatic to not deny the deity of Christ. So anyways, it's the idea that Christ emptied himself of something. Usually what's being talked about is knowledge or abilities. Okay. So how does this, here's how the age-old argument generally goes between proponents of Kenotic Christology, the idea that, Jesus emptied himself of this stuff, and other people. The Kenotic proponent says something like, Jesus gave up knowledge and power at the incarnation. And then somebody objects saying, well, that means he wasn't God. And then the Kenotic proponent responds by saying, no, he's still God. And they say, well, he can't be. Omnipotence and omniscience are essential attributes of God. And then the Kenotic proponent says, no, those aren't essential attributes of God. And the other person says, that's crazy. It's just intuitively oddly. It's like, these are essential things you have to have in order to be God. And then the Kenotic proponent says, well, I don't know. It doesn't seem crazy to me. Like my intuitions are that God can limit himself. And then they both just kind of look at each other. And then they both say to each other, your intuitions are wrong. Like that is, for the most part, how this argument has gone. Like if you look in the first chapter of my book is talking about like, objections to Kenotic Christology over the years and responses to it. And in that, I go into more depth. But I just saved you reading the entire first chapter of my book, pretty much. Okay, like that's a really good summary of how this goes, right? So if we're going to put this essential attributes objection simply, it's going to be something like this. This is kind of the main argument against Kenotic Christology. It's going to go premise 1, God is essentially omnipotent / omniscient, whatever you want to plug in. 2, Jesus is God. 3, therefore, Jesus is essentially omnipotent / omniscient. All right, like that's how it goes. And then of course, Kenotic Christology says, well, Jesus isn't essentially XYZ. Therefore, we have this problem. So that's the essential attributes objection. So my thesis is that the essential attributes objection fails. Past rebuttals have responded by denying that omnipotence and omniscience are essential attributes of deity or essential attributes to be divine. My rebuttal is going to say, you know what, you can have them. I'm going to grant you that these are essential attributes of God. This whole thing that everybody's been fighting about, I'm just going to say, yeah, have at it. I'm going to grant you this, and I'm still going to get away with it, right? So here are my two strategies for doing this. One strategy, and I give two strategies in the book. They can stand independently, or they can work together. You can take one, you can take two, you can take both, you can take neither, whatever. So my first strategy is going to be what I might call the Trinity monotheism strategy, or the Trinity strategy. And this is going to be a strategy that utilizes Trinitarian thinking to tease out ideas with the essential attributes objection. And my second strategy is going to be what I call a promise strategy. So this is going to utilize the implications of God's goodness and his ability to make promises to tease out issues with the essential attributes objection. So let's go ahead and start with that first one. So right, this is going to be because this is a thing. My GIF isn't working. Okay, so this is going to be my objectively bad Trinity argument, right? So in my work, I say let's get everybody's juices flowing, or our theological juices flowing by looking at an objectively bad argument, right? So here's my objectively bad argument. 1, God is 3 persons. 2, Jesus is God. 3, therefore Jesus is 3 persons. If this is a valid argument, we're in trouble, right? Like that's the picture here. Everything's on fire, right? Like Jesus is supposed to be 1 person. There was this whole Nestorianism thing that was concerned about whether or not Jesus was 2 persons, and oh boy, now it looks like we've got 3, right? So if this is a valid argument, if this is a good argument, if this is sound, we're going to have a pickle. Now, the question is this a good argument? And to that, I'm going to say, no, it's not a good argument. It's in fact incredibly bad, which is why I start with this. So let's, tease out why this is an incredibly bad argument, all right? So we have these 3 premises. Okay, so we're going to start with these 3 premises. So we're looking at God as 3 persons. So I think unfortunately some of my notes on here got deleted, some of my markups. So that's okay. So we've got God as 3 persons. What we're going to want to do is we're going to want to look at what that first statement is. God is, right? So when we say is, are we talking about an is of identity or an is of predication? So let me kind of dive into the difference there, right? So an is as a statement of identity is going to be something like Batman is Bruce Wayne, water is H2O, 2 + 2 is 4, right? So these type of statements are going to be things that identify one thing with the other. These are just absolutely the same. We might use this the language of numerical identity, right, when it comes to philosophy. So if we're using is as a statement of identity, something like James is the current U.S. president, Zach is the current U.S. president, but James is not Zach. Yeah, so for this, so if X is Y in an identity sense, to say X is Y is for this to be true, everything true of X must be true of Y. And if we discover that there's something true of X that's not true of Y, this entails that X is not identical to Y. So an example of this is, the person who knocked on my door at midnight last night is identical to the 46th president of the US. That sounds like the start of, a pretty interesting story. But now if I said that and then, you found out that I told you, oh yeah, the person was like 5'2", a Latino woman, like the story probably starts to get less interesting because you realize like, oh, like it wasn't actually a president because like some of these properties you're giving me, like that's not actually like those aren't properties the president of the U.S. had. So is a statement of predication. So we talked about is as a statement of identity, but sometimes we use is not to identify one thing with another, but to just like describe or ascribe a property to the thing in question. So I'll give you some examples here. James is bald, right? And that's a good one. Today is warm. This presentation is neat, right? These are statements. When you say James is bald, you're not identifying James with baldness. So like everywhere baldness is present, James is present. You're not saying everything true of James is true of baldness, right? You're just saying I have the property of being bald. So we could say something like James is bald, William is bald, but James is not William. Like that's completely fine. There's no problems there, right? So it's the same type of sentence that we saw with the other one that we said was nonsense. But because we're using this in a predicative sense, like we're good to go, right? So these are the two different types of is, right? So now let's go back to an objectively bad argument here. When we look at this, when we say God is 3 persons, this term God, what is that picking out? Well, we can tell that this is probably picking out the Trinity. Why? Because it's the next words that come after it has to do with there being 3 persons. Like, okay, God is 3 persons. What that means there is the Trinity is 3 persons. Okay, well, sounds right. Now let's go down to premise 2. Jesus is God. When we say Jesus is God, do we mean that in an identity sense or do we mean that in a predication sense? Okay, so let's play with the idea that this is in a sense of identity. So if Jesus is God in identity sense, and we're using God in the same way that it was used in premise 1, then that means premise 2 would become Jesus is identical to the Trinity. But like no one's going to affirm that. Like if that's the second premise of your argument, then I'll at that point we're just going to be like, that's silly. Get out of here with that. Rather, what we're saying when we say Jesus is God is we're not identifying Jesus with like the Trinity. We're saying Jesus has this property of being divine or has deity or something along those lines. But then when we do that, well, then it turns out that this seemingly innocent looking. Oh, see, yeah. So some of my markups here don't. Some of them don't show up, and some of them do. So, yeah. So I'll have to. I'm trying to do it off the cuff during my head. I didn't remember what my markups were. So let's see. Yeah. So what does that mean? Is of identity. And so, okay, there we go. This isn't a good argument, right? Disappointment here. So now let's go back and let's see. Yeah. Okay, we talked about this. So there was ambiguity. So the point here is that when we say Jesus is God, that's an ambiguous statement. In one sentence, we're using God is X. We're using that in one way. And then the second statement, when we say Jesus is X, we're using it in a different way. In the first one, we're taking the noun God and we're ascribing, some type of properties to it, namely that it's 3 persons. But then in the second statement, we're using a statement of identity. But because of how language works, it looks so grammatically similar to the first one, it looks like we're going to have a contradiction. So this is kind of just playing on the ambiguity of the word is here. So okay, let's compare that bad Trinity argument to the bad canonic argument that we started off talking about. Right? So here we see in the bad Trinity argument, God is 3 persons. And then the bad canonic argument, God is essentially omnipotent / omniscient. Okay, so both of them are starting out the same way, God is. Okay, and then the next premise on both of these is Jesus is God, exact same premise. And then the conclusion is, therefore, Jesus is, and they just plug in the thing that was ascribed to God in the first premise, right? And so it's essentially, this is essentially the same argument. It's the same type of argument being given in each. And so the same way that I responded to the bad Trinity argument, I'm going to respond to the bad canonic argument in the same way. So here's what I'm going to do with that. My next slide. Okay, there we go. So let's dismantle this bad canonic argument, right? So we saw how we could dismantle it with the bad Trinity argument. I'm going to do the exact same thing. I'm going to say, okay, God is essentially omnipotent / omniscient. I'm going to say, okay, what are we referring to there? Because if you're a Trinity monotheist, you're going to want to define God as the Trinity. So this is the position of the Trinity that I talk about a good bit in my book in chapter 2. So Trinity monotheism is going to say God is the Trinity. God is identical to the Trinity. So if you think of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit as a set, that's what God is. So with that definition of God in mind, premise 1 becomes, for me, the Trinity is essentially omnipotent /omniscient. Okay, cool. So now what? So now we go to premise 2. Jesus is God. It's like, okay, so is this is of identity? Is it is of predication? Well, what it's going to be is, because we're not going to want to affirm that Jesus is the Trinity. When we say that, what we really mean is Jesus is divine, right? He has divinity as a property. He has deity, because no one's going to run around saying Jesus is God. Like if we're using God to mean the Trinity, pretty much no one's going to say, aha, you have to hold to the conclusion that Jesus is the Trinity. Like we all recognize that's silly. But now once we have our argument looking like this, like the original big bad essential attributes argument, which is going to knock down Kenotic Christology. Now once we remove some of the ambiguity here, now let's look at it. The Trinity is essentially omnipotent / omniscient. 2, Jesus is divine. Therefore, Jesus is essentially omnipotent / omniscient. Well, that just doesn't follow anymore. Once we've removed the ambiguity here, this doesn't follow. So that doesn't work. So what you're going to need to do is you're going to need to argue that Jesus can't be divine unless he has certain properties. So this brings us to the question of, under what conditions can we predicate divinity to a person? Here's my take, right? Let's work through this together. What makes an action a divine action? I'm going to say it's whether or not God commits the act. Seems reasonable. What makes a thought a divine thought? Whether the thought is in the mind of God, whether or not it's God having the thought, right? What makes a person a divine person? Whether that person is a member of the Trinity. And it seems pretty reasonably. That seems like a pretty good a bar or criteria to meet to see if a person meets the bar to be divine. So with that in mind, I'm going to say that, Jesus is still divine. So let's put this all together, right? So God, the Trinity, is essentially omnipotent, omniscient, so on and so forth. I'm going to say Jesus is God in a predicative sense. And the reason I'm going to say that is, to be divine, a person doesn't have to possess all the properties of God, the Trinity as a whole. The person just has to stand in a certain relationship to the Trinity. Jesus if Jesus empties himself of power or knowledge at the incarnation, but he's still a member of the Trinity, then it's still going to be true that Jesus is divine. Like, we're going to still be able to say Jesus is God in a predicative sense, and the predicative sense of Jesus is God was what we're going to have to say anyways. And I'll pause here just for a moment to talk about the idea. I think there are probably going to be some people who are going to want to say, no, I'm not just saying Jesus is God in a predicative sense. I'm saying Jesus is God. Jesus is identical to God. That's not going to work. If you want to go down that route, you're going to end up being a Unitarian. Because if you say Jesus is God in an identity sense, and you say the Father is God in an identity sense, then like the logic of that is Jesus is the Father. Like, that is just logically what follows if we're talking about this in a manner of identity. So unless you want to collapse into a Unitarian position, if you want to maintain the Trinity, you're going to have to say that when we make a statement like Jesus is God and the Father is God, we're going to have to say that this is not a statement of identity for that to be coherent. So so there we go. That's kind of my first strategy. Is I'm going to say Jesus has this way of, or proponents of Kenotic Christology have this way of affirming that God is essentially omnipotent/omnipotent. We can say Jesus emptied himself of knowledge and power at the incarnation. And at this point, and if you want to take just this strategy, I can even say Jesus emptied himself of omniscience and omnipotence. So at this point in my argument, I could even affirm, I could say, yeah, Jesus gives up omnipotence. Jesus gives up omniscience. I could say all that. But I could say, because he is still a member of the Trinity, he still meets that condition which is needed to be considered divine. And so Jesus never ceases to be God in a predicative sense. And so it's like, okay, like where are you at now? Essential attributes objection. Like, your whole thing was that I couldn't affirm that Jesus is God. Well, it seems like I can, because he's still a member of the Trinity. And so what I'm doing is I'm just saying that I'm using this type of, Trinity monotheism. And I talk about this idea of Trinity monotheism and, how it's developed by guys like William Lane Craig, Andrew Kirshner, and stuff like that. I talk about that in my book. I'm just like going really kind of quickly over the kind of bare basics here. So how do you defeat this argument? You're going to have to do one of two things. You're going to have to show that a person must have omnipotence/omniscience in order for us to be, rightfully predicate divinity to that person. And this is the position that a lot of people are going to take. This is the position that guys like William Lane Craig take. They're just like, oh, how could it's obvious that someone's not divine. They can't be called God if they don't have these properties. What I'm going to say is like, okay, you have to show that. If you want to object to Kenotic Christology, you're going to have to show that that's the case. Or you could show that Trinity monotheism, like, it's bad for other reasons. Like, you can object to Trinity monotheism as a model of the Trinity and say it's garbage. And there are people who have done that, and I offer some defenses of Trinity monotheism against objections in my book. But those are going to be the two general ways you're going to have to go, and I don't think it's going to happen. So, okay, that's path one, right? Path one is just talking about how Jesus is a member of the Trinity and how we can say Jesus is God because of him being a member of the Trinity. And members of the Trinity don't essentially have all the same properties as the Trinity as a whole. So now we're into path two, divine promises. All right. So with this one, I'm also going to start us out with a bad argument that's going to cause us a lot of panic. All right. So here's my another bad argument. Yeah, are you okay there, Adam? I saw you
panicking. What?
Yeah. So here's the thing. In the original, yeah. So here's the thing. In the original thing, these don't pop up right here, right? So this is when I originally did this, I clicked through to make those show up on screen. So when this is originally supposed to come up, it's not initially there. So just pretend they're not there.
I was going to say real quick as well. Yeah. A point you made earlier about Jesus being God in a predicative sense, even like most people who have Trinitarian models would say that, because even on like monarchical Trinitarianism, they would say the Father is God in an identity sense, and then the Holy Spirit and the Son are God in a predicate sense. And so I think that even if you think you don't hold to that idea, you probably do, because most people are monarchical Trinitarians. So I would say, like, if you hold to a view like monarchical Trinitarianism, you already believe that Jesus is God in a predicate sense. That's what I was going to say.
Yeah, it's you're really going to have a hard time getting away from that. Okay, so here's my other bad argument, right? So fresh argument, right? Here we go. So premise one: if God is omnipotent, it is possible for God to destroy the earth with a flood. Premise two: if God promises not to do something, it is not possible for him to do that thing. Premise three: God has promised not to destroy the earth with a flood. Premise 4, it is not possible for God to destroy the earth with a flood. 5, therefore, God is not omnipotent. Now, if this is a successful argument, then again, panic, right? This is where I would make all the panics pop onto the screen. Yeah. So this is a good argument. Oh boy, now we have to affirm. This isn't even about Kenotic Christology. This is in general. Now we all have to affirm that God is not omnipotent, and ooh, that's scary. So now we're going to have to answer the question of, is this a good argument? Well, I'm going to say, no, it's not a good argument. So let's walk through the premises together and see which ones we can object to. Okay, premise 3. Can we object to premise 3? God has promised not to destroy the earth with a flood. Nope, it's good. Why? Because we know in Scripture that God's promised not to do this. So it's green. We can't reject it. So we have to look elsewhere if we want to get out of this argument. What about premise 2? If God promises not to do something, it is not possible for him to do that thing. We also can't object to that, because we have this idea, I think it's Hebrews 6, where it's like God cannot lie, so he guarantees something to Abraham by making this promise, so on and so forth. And then also even just outside of like Hebrews 6, which Hebrews 6 explicitly is like, once God guarantees something by promising it, so because he can't lie. Even outside of that, I think we'd all like probably agree that if God promises to do something and then he breaks that promise, like it's kind of immoral, and isn't God supposed to be morally perfect? So anyways, not going to be able to object to premise 2. Okay, where else are we going to look? Premise 4, like that's just the conclusion of the, that just follows from the other premises, so can't really object to that. 5 is just the conclusion. So, oh no, the only thing that we are left being able to object to is this statement that if God is omnipotent, it is possible for God to destroy the earth with a flood. That's what we have to attack if we want to get out of this bad argument. So it turns out that's actually a pretty easy thing to do, because that statement is not unconditionally true. So what does omnipotence entail? Omnipotence does not entail doing logically impossible things or immoral things. I have a section in my book in chapter 3 where I talk about kind of different models of omnipotence and things related to that. I'm going to move super quickly here. So omnipotence, it's generally recognized among theologians that omnipotence just doesn't entail that God has to be able to do immoral things or logically impossible things. So why can't God destroy the earth with a flood? Well, because he promised not to, and breaking that promise would be immoral, right? So if we were going to kind of make a list of things that an omnipotent being can do and things that an omnipotent being can't do, on the can side, we're going to have, okay, God can destroy, at least initially, prior to any promises being made. The things that God can do is going to be things like destroy the earth with a flood. Well, we know he can do that. He did it once, right? He can cook bacon on a Wednesday. He can make a brick levitate. He can make a promise to his creatures, so on and so forth. And then initially, pre-promises or anything like that, the things that God can't do, let's just keep it simple. Let's just say it's those two things. God can't do logically impossible things, and he can't do immoral things. But here's the thing, like the idea that God can make a promise with his creatures, if he can do that, well, now what if God promises not to destroy the earth with a flood? Well, now that's no longer on the can list. Now that's on the can't list. And the reason that that's on the can't list is because that would now be immoral. And God can do this with all sorts of things. God can promise not to cook bacon on a Wednesday, and now that's on the can't list. And the reason it's on the can't list is because now that's an immoral thing to do. So God can make anything he wants. Essentially, he can move anything he wants from the things he can do list to the can't do list if he just promises not to do it. Right. So there's this age-old question: can God make a rock too big, so heavy that he can't lift? Yeah, he can. Here's how he does it. He makes a rock of any size and he promises not to lift it, right? Okay, there you go. Like there's a rock, he can't lift it, and it's not a violation of omnipotence, because omnipotence doesn't entail the ability for God to break his promises, right? So this has really interesting implications for Kenotic Christology, because let's suppose that Jesus, he's packing up his things in heaven, he's about to go down and be incarnate, and he says something like this, right? He says something to Father or the heavenly host: I promise to go down and live as one of them, with all of their weaknesses and all their frailties, just as they must depend on the goodwill of the Father and their struggles. I promise to rely on the goodwill of the Father and my struggles. I will not use any of my own powers to aid my earthly life, but like them, I will use only what the Father empowers me to do through his Spirit. I will live in this way so that through my suffering, I can draw them back to us. All right. So the implications, if Jesus makes a promise like this, is that Jesus is emptied of some of his abilities. Like he can't do those things anymore. Like he is bound by his moral perfect goodness, right? This is the idea we get in Hebrews of God, guaranteeing something by making this promise to Abraham, because, once God makes this promise, he can't break it. But Jesus is still omnipotent, because the reason he can't do those things is because they're now immoral, and omnipotence never makes a claim to be able to do immoral things. So, I'm feeling pretty good as like this proponent of Kenotic Christology. I can affirm that Jesus, oh boy, does he limit himself. I can say he's just as limited as like, a normal guy. And I can still say he's actually still omnipotent here, because like all the things he no longer is able to do, those are all things that are now immoral, and everybody agrees omnipotence doesn't entail the ability to do immoral things. So I'm feeling pretty good. But now you're probably, if you're smart, right, and if you're on the ball, or if you're critical of Kenotic Christology, or you just don't like me, you might say, okay, James, that's cute, but can you do that with omniscience? Like, can you manipulate the definition? I don't even think maybe manipulating is the wrong word. Can you take advantage of the standard definitions of omniscience in the same way that you just took advantage of the standard definition of omnipotence, right? Can you do something like this? I'm gonna say, like, maybe it depends. So we'll get the ball rolling with an argument about omniscience, right? We'll just keep putting things in these syllogisms. So let's make an omniscience style argument. So maybe I would want to argue something like this. 1, it is possible for the Son to promise not to know some proposition. Okay. Premise 2, if the Son promises not to know some proposition, he won't know that proposition. 3, it is possible for the Son to not know some proposition. So this is like the type of argument I would put forth. I would say, okay, look, I'm a Kenotic Christology guy. Look, I've argued 3, the conclusion, it's possible for the Son not to know some proposition. So maybe I would want to, go down the promise route in this way. But here's the thing. There's a counter argument to this that I'm going to need to deal with, right? Because someone could reverse this type of argument, and they could do something like this. They could say, okay, James, wait a second. I'm going to argue in the opposite direction. I'm going to argue that if the Son is essentially omniscient, it is impossible for the Son to not know a true proposition. Like, that's just what it means to be omniscient. 2, it's not possible for the Son to make a promise to do something which is impossible. Like that just seems like then the Son would be promising to do something which he knows he's not going to do. That seems wrong. So, okay, yeah, 2 seems to make sense. 3, the Son is essentially omniscient. 4, therefore, it is impossible for the Son to promise not to know some true proposition. It's like, okay, now we're back to where we're started. We're kind of in this deadlock. Like, I have this argument, you have your argument. Like, where are we going to go? What I need is a symmetry breaker, and I think I have a symmetry breaker between these two type of arguments. Here's how I'm going to break the symmetry. I'm going to argue like this. 1, if God's essential omniscience entails that it is impossible for him to make a knowledge restricting promise, like if that's the case, as we just saw in that reverse argument, well then God's essential omnipotence, that should do the same thing. That should also entail that it is impossible for him to make an ability restricting promise. But we know that it's not the case that God's essential omnipotence entails that it is impossible for him to make an ability restricting promise. We know this. God does this. God promises not to destroy the earth with a flood. He's does that. That's a ability restricting promise. It's like, okay, so then he's able to do that. That's premise 2. I got that right there. And so if premise 1 is reasonable, which I think it is, what's going to follow from that is that it's not the case that God's essential omniscience entails that it's impossible for him to make this knowledge restricting promise. So to kind of unpack this, make this a bit clearer, what I'm going to say is like, listen, if you're going to tell me God can't restrict his knowledge through the use of the promise because like he's essentially omniscient, I'm just going to be like, well, wait a second. Like he does it with omnipotence. Like why is there this disconnect there? Like why is it that God's omnipotence is subject to his moral goodness and his ability to make promises, but not his omniscience? Like why does God have that degree of control over one thing and not the other? It seems like the most parsimonious response is going to be like, yeah, these are both things that God can make knowledge restricting promises about. So that's kind of how I'm going to kind of thread that needle and get past that. So is he omniscient? You say, okay, James, listen, you've given me an argument that God can restrict his knowledge, right? He can, not be able to know something. But even that's the case. Let's say I grant you that Jesus makes this promise not to know something, and then he can't know it. In that instance, after Jesus has made that promise, is he omniscient then, right? That's the next question. What I'm going to say is it just kind of depends on the definition of omniscience, right? So let's look at 2 different definitions of omniscience. One definition is X is omniscient only if X knows all true propositions and believes no false propositions. Now, if that's the definition that we're going with, Jesus isn't omniscient in this scenario anymore. If he makes this knowledge restricting promise, he's not going to be omniscient under definition 1. However, there are other definitions of omniscience, and an example of that is definition 2. So this actually comes from Richard Swinburne, who is not a proponent of Kenotic Christology. He's actually critiques Kenotic Christology. So this isn't me just like making up some definition to suit my needs. This actually is a definition coming from a well-known, Christian theologian who is himself not sympathetic to Kenotic Christology. So Swinburne defines omniscience as something like a being is omniscient if he knows at each time all true propositions which it is logically possible that he entertained. And so if we go with something like that, I'm going to have a good time, because I'm going to say, listen, Jesus, he's no longer logically possible for him to entertain these ideas once he's made a promise not to do so. Therefore, he technically meets the criteria to be omniscient, even after he's made these knowledge-restricting promises. So here's the thing, though. You may want to attack definition 2. You may say, well, James, that's just a whack definition. So here's a quote from Benjamin Arbor in regarding this. So Benjamin says, this all runs contrary, this idea of definition 2, we're going to define things in this way of like, okay, what is logically possible for him to entertain. So this actually comes from a quote in this paper in this book where Arbor is he presents these different ideas, different definitions of omniscience. He presents these kind of different like modal definitions, stuff like that. And after presenting these, he has this remark of, like, this is all just runs contrary to what we take to be the most natural interpretation of plain readings of the scriptures of all 3 Abrahamic faiths. So he's just saying, hey, listen, this just goes against like this second definition I'm offering. This is kind of contrived. This isn't the plain reading of the text. So what I'm going to do, I want to make Arbor's argument a little bit stronger. I'm going to help him out here. Okay, let me maybe put some meat on the bone of what he's thinking about here. So he's probably thinking about statements such as 1 John 3:20. For whenever our heart condemns us, God is greater than our heart, and he knows everything. Like, okay, he knows everything. Like that plain reading of the text, right? Job 37:16. Do you know the balancing of the clouds, the wondrous works of him who is perfect in knowledge? So someone like Arbor would probably want to say, listen, the plain reading of the text is not this, second definition of, what is logically possible. It's just, he knows it all. He just knows all true propositions. And I'm sympathetic to this type of, critique by Arbor, but I have a way to slap back, right? So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go back and I'm going to say, well, let's just compare this to how we think about omnipotence. So in Matthew 19:26, Jesus looked at them and said, with man, this is impossible, but with God, all things are possible. Okay, if we're just going to go with the plain natural reading of the text, there are no impossible things. There are no logically impossible things. There are no morally, there are no morally impossible things for God to do. If we're just gonna be like, okay, we're going with the plain reading of the text, this statement would entail that an omnipotent being can actualize any proposition whatsoever, which pretty much no theologian holds to that. But we don't take Matthew 19:26 out of context and just like go with that with our understanding of omnipotence. Rather, we understand verses like Matthew 19:26 in light of verses like Hebrews 6:8, which says, so that by 2 unchangeable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled for refuge might have strong encouragement to hold fast to the hope set before. So like we look at the entirety of scripture and we understand verses like this one of Matthew in light of the ones like things from Hebrews. So what I'm going to say is like, okay, if we do that with omnipotence, why don't we do that with omniscience? Like if you can, interpret X in light of Y with omnipotence, why don't you do the same thing with omniscience? Why don't we look at passages like 1 John 3:20 in light of passages like Matthew 24:36 in which Jesus says he doesn't know something, or Hebrews 5:8 where we're told Jesus, I think it's he learns obedience or something like that. Like let's be consistent here. So this is one of the things. If you want to come at me and you want to say, okay, listen, like you're this other definition of omniscience that you're going with here, it's just like this contrived thing, and it goes against like a really straightforward reading of the same verse. I'm gonna be like, you do the same thing with omnipotence. So like maybe I am being contrived, but you're contrived with omnipotence as well. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to knock everybody down to the same level and say, okay, like we're all in the same playing field, right? Okay, so I'm going to summarize the 2 strategies here. Okay, so one is going to say God is essentially X. This is the Trinity strategy I went through, right? That strategy was to say God is essentially X. I can say that without saying all of God's parts are essentially X. And I'm going to say Father, Son, Holy Spirit. These are parts of God. Then the second strategy is going to be saying God is essentially X, but then I'm going to say he uses promises to impose limits that don't contradict things like omnipotence, omniscience. And we already talked about that. So that's kind of a general overview of the 2 strategies. Again, I'm going through this very quickly. See the book for more developed, probably more coherent explanation of everything. So, okay, what's the payoff for this? A couple of things here. So one, I'm going to say some people feel an intuitive draw to Kenotic Christology, and these strategies allow people to just follow their intuitions. Like I know some people just are like, yeah, it just seems like Jesus isn't man if he like has all these, like fancy God powers, as he's walking around here. Like they just feel that intuitively. Like I'll be talking with people about Kenotic Christology, and like I'm not even making that argument, right? Like I don't even make that type of argument. That's not one of my reasons for why you should be a proponent of Kenotic Christology. But like people will just offer that themselves. Like this is just like an intuition they have. It's like, okay, yeah, like if you feel that intuitively, like yeah, like maybe you can now follow your intuitions where they lead. And then also Kenotic Christology is what I'm going to say is going to offer a way more intellectually satisfying answer for really clear, explicit limits that Christ displays in Scripture. And so, an example of this is a test case is going to be Matthew 24:36. I have the last chapter of my book dedicated to talking about this. So this is a famous verse, right? But concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. So let me look at a couple different ways, like a couple non-canonic approaches to how people try to get around this text, right? This is how people try to get around this. And I'm gonna let you tell me which one of these seems the most intellectually honest response, and which one of these to an outsider, if a Muslim presents this against us, which one of these sounds like we're just doing backflips to avoid what the Scripture says, and which one of these sounds like we're being intellectually honest. Okay, so approach number one. This is William Lane Craig's approach. Okay, but listen, I know Jesus says, not even the Son knows the hour, of his coming. But when Christ says he does not know the day or hour, you should not read too much into that. He was not speaking as a philosopher of religion. What he really meant was that he had knowledge somewhere down in his unconscious soul, but he just didn't have access to that knowledge. Okay, so that's one approach. The second approach that I look at is Andrew Loke's cryptic approach, which says, when Christ says he does not know the day or hour, what he really meant was that he knew the day and hour, but he was not consciously thinking about that knowledge while he was speaking. That's what it really means. And so, okay, I got the problem there. Okay, third attempt, right? This is the make known approach. Okay. So when Christ says he does not know the day or hour, what he really means is that he's just not going to make it known to the people he was talking to. Okay, so that's the third one. Let's go on and say, okay, here's another one, right? This is a response that is really common. So when Christ says he does not know the day or hour, what he really means is that his human nature does not know the day or hour, but his divine nature does. Thus, Christ both knows the day and the hour and is also ignorant of the day and hour. Okay, so these are all non-canonic approaches to try to get out of this verse. Okay, so here's what you can do. You can do all of these backflips and all of these gymnastics that Jesus actually did know the hour, but only in one nature, and somehow that doesn't entail two persons because I've changed the definitions of what it means to know. So you can go down that line of thought and you can do these contrived backflips, or ta-da, Jesus didn't know the day or hour. You can just be like, yep, Jesus didn't know the day or hour, and then what you can do is you can move the conversation into an area where you're not going to look like you're just ignoring the text and being obtuse. You can be like, yeah, Jesus did know the day or the hour. So let's have a conversation of what are the conditions that need to be met for calling Jesus divine, because then you're shifting the conversation away from what is quite obvious in the text to anyone who I think is being really intellectually honest, which is that Jesus doesn't know the day or the hour. And then you're shifting it to a philosophical conversations of what does it mean to be God? Like, what are the conditions that Jesus needs to meet in order to be divine? And when you get to that conversation, I think you're going to have a whole lot more headway, because that's not one in which you're just going to look at like intentionally obtuse. Like I as a Christian, like when I hear responses, I have a video on my YouTube, but that it's like an hour long, where about an hour long, I think, where I critique someone like Sam Shamoon, who tries to, talk about some of these, other responses. And I rip into them. I'm like, you guys aren't, faithfully engaging with the text here. And I do the same thing in the last chapter of my book. So if you want a more detailed argument on me critiquing these other things, just like for the internal coherence of them and, how much sense they make, I do that in the book. But for here, I'm just saying, like, if you're an outsider, which one of these responses is going to, make you think, okay, this guy I'm listening to, like, he's just never going to admit he's wrong. And which one of these is going to make you think, okay, like he's at least tracking with what the text says. Okay, so I think at that point, yeah, that's the end of my presentation. No, it's been a bit of a mouthful. Feel free to roast me. I'm sorry that my timing and like all my remarks didn't line up as well. I had some fun things in there, and I'm like, oh, I'm gonna have to do this live, and like try to remember where things were. But I think it went pretty much okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna remove it from the stage real quick. First of all, bravo, well done. Yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed this book, and like I said before you got started, I think that this probably would have been my objection to Kenotic Christology before reading the book, because I have honestly never really thought about Kenotic Christology. It's just never really even been on my radar. But as I was reading this book, I was like, okay, this is the one objection that I would probably raise against it. And he like totally shows that it doesn't work, because I think both arguments that you gave, both pathways out, the Trinity argument where you can show that, Jesus, as long as he's a part of the Trinity, he's divine in a predicative sense. And then the promised one, I think that argument is quite, first of all, ingenious, but also quite plausible. And, when you were reading, I want to say it was the second argument regarding his omniscience, where it said like, God cannot make a promise to limit his knowledge. To me, that premise just seems intuitively false, like on its face. It's like, you really wanted to say Jesus can't make a promise? It's so easy. Like, I could say that I promise not to learn about, the ins and outs of, I don't know, volleyball while I'm on this earth. It's like, that's something I could do. And it's like, you want to say that God can't do that? That's just crazy to me. So anyways.
Yeah. So what's funny is I don't think I usually use this language with my two strategies when I present them, but in my mind, and if I'm being honest, I kind of think of them as like the boring strategy and the fun strategy. Like the first strategy, it's good philosophical theology. It's kind of boring, right? I think the second one is like way more fun. This is the one where I was like, okay, this is the one like it's kind of wild. Like, I'll just admit, like it's kind of wild. It's kind of like I feel like there's a lot of moving pieces and I'm kind of moving fast and I'm like, yeah, come at me. I was like, what are you gonna hit? But yeah, I'm glad you found it. I'm glad you found it like interesting and compelling.
I shared it. I have another friend, mutual friend between me and Adam. His name is Mike, and I told him about this, and he and I both were like, "This is like a genius way of arguing about this. Like that, he can make a promise to not do something, and then it's possible." I had never thought of that before, but I think that's quite plausible. So yeah. But both me and my friend were like, "That's a genius answer." So, trying to give you that.
Thank you. You know what's interesting is like the idea of like promises. And so when I was starting this dissertation, I wasn't planning on doing the promise, like that second strategy, the promise strategy. And then I was emailing, I think it's Craig Evans. Yeah, I think it's Evans. He's one of the guys who's before me was like a big Kenotic Christology guy, and he encouraged me to look down this line of thought. So like, this isn't something I just completely pulled out of my butt. I can't take credit for this. Like, he encouraged me to think about this idea. But what's interesting is, if I remember correctly, I think Evans in some of his work, like, he didn't want to think, if I remember correctly, he didn't want to say that that when God makes a promise, it's something like God, passing a law which later legislation can't overturn or something like that. He was reluctant to that idea, and so I was like, that's one of those things I'm like, but why? Like, it was like, it feels like I can make a lot of headway here, and it feels like also it's pretty in the spirit of like that the quote from Hebrews. So yeah, I'm not the first person to like talk about this idea of like God committing himself to covenants, or like God, committing himself to promises. As far as I know, though, I don't know if anybody's cashed it out in the way that I have, in terms of Kenotic Christology and in terms of like Jesus retaining his omniscience. I don't know that anyone's like fleshed it out to the degree I did, but I was pulling on ideas that were already, these themes and concepts of God binding himself in covenants and stuff like that was already out there.
So it seems now hopefully people can understand my ambiguous comments before you started. It's like he still has the attributes of omniscience and omnipotence on your view. It's just that he's promised to lay them down in the incarnation. And so it's actually logically impossible for him to possess those exact powers while he's in the incarnation, while he still possesses those properties. Because the reason he doesn't possess those properties is because it's now immoral for him to. So now you guys kind of see what I was talking about at the beginning, where it's like he has these properties, but he doesn't. And yeah, so hopefully now everyone understands what I meant by that. What do you think, Adam?
So I'm far more skeptical. I do like a lot of the trains of thought, but I would say that I have probably more questions than we're going to get through today. Because all these things could be possible, but I think that you would need a lot further explanations for me in order to kind of get through the explanations of all these aspects. So I'm trying to debate, actually, I guess, a little bit on which one to try and tackle a little bit. But one, I guess this is to be the first one, because I think it's the most obvious. And that would be like, because your original argument was the idea that, well, you're going to just grant that Jesus does have all of these as essential attributes, right?
Well, so my first one was to grant that these are essential attributes of God. So yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Because because then in my first strategy, I'm kind of sneaky, and I'm like, okay, these are essential attributes of God, but not to all of God's parts. This, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So now we can move right to the kind of a second point here. So if that's the case, in essence, if you ask the logical question, can God become man? Right?
Mm-hmm.
Can God become man? This can only be true on something like a binitarian or trinitarian pathway, right?
It depends on what
Like,
God
it cannot
is.
be true in a Unitarian. It can't be true in a Unitarian sense.
I don't know. So let me think. I don't know that I would say, when you say God become man, are you talking about in a canonic sense that I'm talking about?
Yes.
So the reason I asked this clarifying remark. Okay, so this is. And in my book, I don't argue for Kenotic Christology. So like some proponents of Kenotic Christology are like, Jesus just isn't, like this has to happen in order for Jesus to become a man. I don't go down that line of argument in my book. Whether I use a more like soteriological approach where I say, and I draw from Hebrews for this, Jesus emptied himself not because he had to do this in order to become man. I actually think Jesus could meet the conditions to be a man, even if he didn't empty himself. Rather, what I'm going to say is I think that Jesus did this because he wouldn't have had the credentials and the qualifications to be like our high priest or whatever if he didn't do this. So the reason this is causing me pause with your question is if someone was a Unitarian and they thought that God could become man and without being engaging in some type of kenosis. If that's the case, if kenosis isn't required to become a man, I'm like, okay, maybe someone could say like God could still become a man in this scenario. But then here's another thing. Okay, so this is also an idea I talk about in the book. There's regarding the idea of so in my instance, when I have someone kenosis, like you have Jesus who he's canonically incarnate. Let's say he gives up a bunch of power, but like the Father is still being the Father, right? Like he's still like in control. He's still God, stuff like that. One of the objections that comes up in the first chapter of my book that I talk about is the idea is like, well, okay, like can all three become incarnate at once? Can all three of them like give up their power at once? And if so, like, then aren't you saying like it's possibly the case that there's like no God that's like controlling everything? And you can take it, I think probably a couple of different responses there, but one of the responses that comes up in the literature that I discussed in the opening is the idea that you may just be like, no, not all of them can become canonically incarnate in this way. You may be like, listen, for one person to do it is fine because then there's still a God at the wheel of the universe. But if all three of them did it, then that it seems like wrong for God to like leave the universe as like without a God in control. So like maybe that's something that would be immoral for God to do. So like these are the kind of concerns I have with your Unitarian thing. So I'm not sure I would grant that a Unitarian couldn't affirm a canonic Christology, a canonic approach. They couldn't go with the first strategy because that's like explicitly using the Trinity, but they could maybe go with something like the second.
So like I'm not even sure like how that would be possible, because to me that would be the notion. So like I mean, like I guess it to me it rubs against like kind of the idea, right? It's like, okay, can God limit his knowledge to where he doesn't know that he's God anymore? And in a Unitarian sense, right, that would be like completely total and absolute, right? So to me, that runs into the question is like, okay, so if a Unitarian God says, can a Unitarian God stop being God? So just see this as a contradiction, right?
Yeah, I'm not Unitarian, so I'm not like dead set on defending a Unitarian here. But I think
I'm just kind of framing it like I feel like your Kenotic Christology can only work in some sort of multi-personal framework.
Interesting. I don't know. I guess my inclination is like, so let's say I'm going to play the Unitarian here, even though I'm like not. If I was a Unitarian, I think I would say something like, so I'm going to define God as something like perfect being, and perfect being as like omnipotence, omniscience, stuff like that. And what I would say is like, okay, if God is this perfect being and he promises to like, I don't know, not be able to like play golf on a Wednesday or something like that. So now he doesn't have that ability. I'm going to say, well, like, okay, like I defined God as being this perfect being. A perfect being has these properties. Even if God can't play, that golf on a Wednesday, like he's still meets my definition of God. So I would say like, yeah, we still have one, even if he becomes, even if he goes through this kenosis. So I think a Unitarian could squeak something out here. But like most Unitarians aren't probably going to want to, because most Unitarians deny the deity of Christ in the first place. Yeah,
that's what I was thinking. I'm like, a Unitarian isn't going to even be worried about the incarnation because they deny the incarnation, right? They just think that Jesus was like I guess you could say a messenger or a prophet or like our Messiah, but they don't grant that he incarnated. So this wouldn't even be like an issue for a Unitarian.
Unless you're a oneness Pentecostal, because they think that Jesus and the Father are the same guy. They're the same person. But they have a whole host of other issues.
Yeah, so maybe a modalist might we maybe should think about how this would apply to modalists, but
I don't care how this applies
Yeah.
for modalism.
Yeah.
I to be honest, like I think modalism is so whack. Like I was actually
Yeah, I agree.
working on a Christology book right now, and I have like I was like addressing the modalist position. I'm like, yeah, 3 paragraphs, that's good enough. This is whack. I'm not spending more time on this. So if you're a modalist out there and you want to know whether or not this will work for you, you're gonna have to do that legwork on your own because yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Modalism is like for sure like the most whack. Actually, I'm not going to go that route. I was going to make a comment. I did want to say really quick. I wanted to ask because I know that we're all familiar with R.T. Mullins as well. So in R.T. Mullins' most recent book, Eternal in Love, he actually argues that omniscience isn't the complete perfection that God needs. He actually argues that God needs like perfect cognitive excellence, and omniscience is just a part of that. So, would you agree with his assessment there, James, or like what do you? And if so, how does that affect? I guess this. Would you say that Jesus just acts within perfect reasons and he perfectly responds to moral reasons and all these other things while he's incarnate?
Yeah. So I've read most. I think I've read all or most of Mullen's book, Eternal in Love. Good book. Recommend people check it out. Yeah, I found that interesting because I think I think what that would fall into the category of is like. Part of me thinks that maybe as far as like my strategies go, part of me thinks that goes back to so that would actually not. That would be denying omniscience is the essential attribute. That would be saying that something else is an essential attribute. So then that would be kind of in the first chapter of my book. I talk about other like the pathways that people have taken that don't affirm these things as essential attributes. So I think that would probably be like more in line with them. Yeah, probably so because if he's denying omniscience is essential, but it's really something else. I think that would probably. I probably. We wouldn't need to get into my 2 strategies at that point, potentially, because then, at least as far as it regards omniscience, because then the thing that God is essentially is that Jesus lacks, like it's not even a thing anymore.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if someone were to agree with Mullins, like let's say I were to agree with Mullins, like, okay, omniscience isn't the essential property. It's actually maximum cognitive excellence. Could we modify your thesis to where these still work? So would they want to say like, it's impossible, like basically just replace omniscience with perfect cognitive excellence in all of your arguments? Do you think it would still work? Or do you think that would
I think you could probably make it work. I would need to know. I would have to look at how he defines maximum cognitive excellence, and then whether or not a canonic Christ meets that criteria. But just going off my memory, I think his view of that would mesh well with canonic Christology in general, even if it like ends up being a different path, or maybe just using some of my ideas. I think it would mesh well. I think I remember reading it and thinking it would mesh well. Yeah.
Yeah, because I'm sympathetic to his view, which is why I'm asking. And then, like I said, I think your book here at least knocked down the major wall for me to believe in canonic Christology. I still wouldn't say I've like fully adopted it, but I definitely like that would have been like my number one objection. And I really feel like your book took down that objection for me. I know Adam said he was still a little skeptical, but for me, I felt like, okay, I'm more willing to be open to it, I guess, is how I felt like after I read your book.
I think Adam is skeptical about some of the stuff that I do in chapter 4 that it's more about a motivation for canonic Christology, because me and Adam have emailed a bit about so because like there's stuff I talk about in my book that I didn't talk about in my thing, and one of those is I kind of give this potential argument that one might run on why Jesus needs to be canonically incarnate in order to be our like high priest, and like they're kind of play on the idea of like Jesus's ability to like sympathize with us and things along those lines. And so I know that Adam has talked with me about that in the past, and so maybe is it more? Am I correct that it's more that line of thought that you're skeptical about, or is it this?
I wouldn't necessarily say that's it. I mean, it's literally like just like I just have plenty of questions, so like I'm a little bit more. I like to like kind of have the answers to everything. So like I do think your propositions are interesting. I'm not 100% sure if they all kind of parse themselves. I don't know. Like, and again, I'm not entirely making like a strong objection to everything, but so like that is one of them that I do think is interesting. So this is like a completely unrelated point, but so we were talking about the idea. It's like, okay, So part of your major idea is that it's like, okay, well, Jesus has to empty himself to fulfill the promises of being high priest. And it's like, okay, cool. That's good. But I am curious. I don't know if you have like a list, but what are the necessary and sufficient conditions in order to fulfilling that part? So like in this case, you kind of assert or seem to input like the idea that like, well, part of the necessary conditions are that he can't be omnipotent and he can't be omniscient. He needs to have some sort of limiting factors to accomplish this. And one of the ones that we talked about, which I do think is kind of the interesting aspect, is that, well, what about impeccability? In other words, like, is it possible for Jesus to sin? Right? Can that be part of the equation? And you seem like you want to say like, well, he's still impeccable. And I'm kind of going like, okay, well, maybe that's true, but why is it true? Like if he limits himself and he empties himself of omniscience and omnipotence, why doesn't he empty himself of his moral goodness?
Well, I can actually take a crack at that one. So
Please do.
whenever he makes a promise, right, the reason that it makes it impossible for him to do that action is because it's immoral. Like that's a part of it, right? So if he promises to like remove his morality, then it no longer this line of thinking would totally like I guess be amiss. Like the whole line of thinking is predicated on his perfect goodness, if that makes sense.
So maybe okay, go ahead, Adam.
Oh yeah, let me just respond because this is actually part of the dialogue that James and I had, which is exactly goes like this. And so basically the point was this, right? When does he make the promise? He makes the promise in his divinity before incarnating, right? Before emptying himself. Well,
can I pause
therefore,
you there?
like in what sense? Oh, go ahead.
So this is just a fun idea. So when I was doing my dissertation, one of my advisors actually encouraged me to, if I remember correctly, encouraged me to potentially tease out the idea that the promise or the need for this actually could come from some Old Testament things that God says about like, promises that things he's going to do. Like maybe you could say like the promises that God gives about how he's going to redeem, his people and do all this stuff. Like those are themselves the promises that end up binding him later. Like ground the promise that I'm talking about here in this Old Testament stuff. And I'm really open to that, but I was just like, I'm not confident enough on that playing out, like, and it being strong that I want to put it in my dissertation. I'd rather argue things I think I can defend. But I think there's an interesting idea though. So there's just something to flirt with. Like, I just want to make clear, it may not be that like it's just pre-incarnation where Jesus is like, all right, let me list out my promises so I can, get these restrictions on me that way. I mean, it may just be like these are the restrictions and the need for this, these come about from a much earlier promise that we see somewhere in Scripture. That's a fun idea. If anybody's out there looking for a dissertation thesis or master's thesis, or work with that. I think it could be cool.
Yeah. So to me, the point is this: is that Jesus then, if he empties himself, then why doesn't he empty himself of the promises? In essence, like under what circumstance or why would he be compelled to accomplish or complete these promises?
Yeah, so I actually talk about this. This is relevant to something I talk about in chapter 2. Okay, so a couple of things here. So this is actually relevant to my response is going to be relevant to how Craig responded to me and then how I respond to Craig in my book. So I say to Craig, I'm like, hey, listen, man, like you say that these members of the Trinities, they don't have to have all the properties that the Trinity as a whole has. And he says, okay, yeah, but like you can't do this with all properties. Like surely there are some properties that like the Trinity possesses that the person also has to possess. And he gives some examples, and one of these is like being morally good. And then what I do in my book is I'm like, okay, yeah, but like I can give an argument for why Jesus can't give up more perfect goodness. And here's my argument for why Jesus can't give up like perfect moral goodness. Is I'm going to say God is essentially like God is morally perfect, right? Okay, so this is something that we all generally affirm. And we might say something like God is essentially completely holy, morally perfect. Like there's no evil in him. He is like morally perfect. But like if Jesus can give up impeccability and if he can give up that, and then he can sin, then there's a possible world in which God isn't morally perfect. Like in that scenario, like there would be a part of God that is evil, wrong, whatever. But what I'm going to say is like, no, that can't happen. Like God is essentially like morally, wholly morally perfect. And so it's an Jesus giving up his impeccability and sinning would entail under if you're incorporating moral perfection, wholly complete moral perfection as like a property of God. If Jesus did that, then God wouldn't exist, or something like that. God as defined in this way. So that's one line that I would go down. But another line that I would go down is I would be like, listen, and this is a fun line of thought. It's like, well, the kind of idea that I'm presenting is that God's moral goodness is in some sense like more foundational to who he is than his omnipotence and omniscience and stuff like that. And I think I have scriptural grounds for affirming that because like, go back to that passage in Hebrews where he guarantees this thing to Abraham by grounding it in his moral goodness, by grounding it in this promise. So like, God assuring this action, God is able to, solidify this as happening because he can ground it in his moral goodness. That seems to, if we're talking about like what's most important to God or like what's more foundational to God, it seems like moral goodness is the thing that is the foundation, or it's more foundational or more important or whatever than these other things, so that moral goodness can exert control over omnipotence, or moral goodness can exert influence and can bind omnipotence and omniscience, but it doesn't go the other way. Omnipotence and omniscience, they can't exert themselves over moral goodness. And there are theologians who want to make that position. So in the Promise book, like Locke, or in the Promise chapter, Locke wants to compromise God's essential moral perfect goodness in order to maximize God's power. And then I roast Locke. I critique Locke for that. I'm like, this is just really problematic, and you're not paying God any compliments at this point. So yeah, that's kind of the two main ways I would think about responding to that.
I actually just thought of a reductio ad absurdum that might show this is actually impossible. Like you're saying that he can't, or that he can empty himself of goodness. I actually think I just thought of a way to show that that's actually impossible through a reductio. So let's take the promise to not flood the earth, right? So God promised not to flood the earth. Therefore, it is not possible for him to flood the earth. And again, this is because it is predicated on his goodness. Once he makes a promise, it's impossible for him to break it. But if God could actually empty himself of his morality, then he would no longer have to follow that promise, and it would actually become possible again for him to flood the earth. Because the reason he can't break these promises is because of his moral goodness. And so if it were actually possible for God to do that, then the Bible would be lying. And so if you want to hold to the Bible and say that God can't flood the earth anymore, then it seems to me you have to say that God cannot empty himself of his moral goodness, because that would contradict Scripture. Because otherwise God could flood the earth again. It would actually be possible for God to do that.
Well, see, that's actually an idea I tease out in the book in responding to Andrew Locke, because Locke thinks that like, God can't sin like simpliciter, but then he can take on the ability to sin when he becomes incarnate or something along those lines. And one of the things I point out with Locke is like, well, at that point, God doesn't ever guarantee anything by making a promise. Because like if I make a promise and like I can't break it only when I'm wearing this shirt, but I can take the shirt off, like, okay, then I can make a promise. Oh, I'm so bound, and I just change shirts. Now I can break it. Like I didn't guarantee anything. And so if God's goodness is something he can just pick up and put down, there's no way for God to like guarantee anything by making a promise, because then God can just, I promise, I'm guaranteeing it because of my goodness, but now I can drop my goodness. Like, yeah. So I think you're thinking along the right lines there, and that's something that I think I think like Andrew Locke messes up on, and I critique him on in the work. Is I don't think you can treat moral goodness like that's something that can be picked up and put down by God.
Yeah. The whole line of thinking is that what makes it impossible is his goodness, right? Like that's the whole idea. It's like the reason God cannot flood the earth is because of his goodness. He has made a promise, and his goodness makes it impossible for him to break that promise. And so it seems like this whole line of reasoning assumes and it requires his goodness, because as you said, his goodness is like more foundational. And I think the reason for that is, and maybe you would agree or disagree with this, but it seems to me the most foundational thing about God is his loving nature. Like he's a loving nature. He's perfectly loving. And I think that is what makes him perfectly good, because when you love perfectly, you always do good. So it seems to me like it flows out of his love. So you would almost be arguing that God can stop being perfectly loving in order to make that argument, which I think would be really problematic.
Get him, Adam.
So I feel like part of the thing here is that you guys both seem to be like basically asserting that, yeah, his omnipotence and omniscience are not essential attributes. Because part of your major point is like, well, these things are essential, and therefore he cannot cease to have them in any way. He always has to be omnibenevolent. However, that's not true of his omnipotence and omniscience.
No, remember, because I grant that. So like in my I grant that. But what I say is like God is I grant that omnipotence and omniscience are essential attributes to God. But rather, the position I take is that while they are all essential to God, God's goodness can exert a degree of restricting control over omniscience and omnipotence, and that's a one-way street. So that's the distinction. It's not which ones are essential or not. It's which ones are allowed to exert the control, and the other, which one are more important or more foundational or whatever.
And also, I will say too.
Adam had something to say to that. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. I see him smiling. Yeah.
I'll let you go.
Well, because so basically you're saying that, well, his goodness is more essential, right? But the other ones are only quasi-essential.
It's not more essential, right? Because so to say that something is essential is to say that the being can't exist and not have those things. So all of them are essential in the sense that like there's no possible world in which God exists and he doesn't exemplify these properties. So so let me give you an example. Okay, I can give you an example. So we're just gonna open a can of worms here. Okay, so like I'm not like okay, listen. So I'm going to use the idea of like eternal generation and monarchical Trinitarianism. I'm going to use this as like an analogy or like a consideration. This does not mean I subscribe to this idea. So monarchical Trinitarians will often say that Jesus is like he is contingent upon the Father, right? So they'll say that he is contingent upon the Father, but so someone like Andrew Kirshner, if I remember his work correctly, someone like Kirshner will say that Jesus is contingent upon the Father, but Jesus is still he's contingent upon the Father in like all possible worlds, so to speak, or there's no possible world in which the Father does not cause the Son to exist. So someone like that would say, like, listen, the Father is more foundational. So this language comes up a lot in Trinity conversations, because monarchical Trinitarians want to say the Father is the ultimate grounding source of everything, and he eternally grounds the Son and Spirit. But the fact that the Son and Spirit are grounded, like they may still want to affirm that they are like metaphysically, it's impossible for them not to exist. Or if I remember correctly, Kirshner goes down this right of saying it's impossible for them not to exist because it's not possible for God to like not generate them, because that would be like immoral or something like that. So like just as like this as some branches of Trinitarianism, and this is like something that's really prominent throughout Christian history. Just as some Trinitarians would want to say like the Father is in a sense more foundational than the Son, that wouldn't necessarily entail that like therefore the Son is not also something that's eternal, or that the Son could cease to exist or something along those lines. I don't know if that analogy helped. Adam seems skeptical.
I just don't want to go down that road.
Okay, here's an easier way. Okay, so here's an easier way. Something that becomes common is, so some philosophers, when it comes to defining God, they define the kind of simple way to define God. I think Mullins does this. Is they say God's just a perfect being. Like, okay, like really simple definition of God. Like God's just like this perfect being. And then what they do after that is they show that like all these other things that we want to say about God, they just all kind of like come about or implications of or unfold from his perfection, like God's like omniscience, his omnipotence, stuff like that. These are all just kind of implications or derived from his goodness, right? So like the big ultimate like foundational, or his perfection, excuse me. So the big ultimate foundational thing is like God is perfect, and then all these other things are just kind of like they stem off from they are like branches off the tree, and the trunk is the trunk of is like God's perfection or something like that. And that's just like a way of phrasing it that I'm coming up with. I'm not saying everyone who holds to like perfect being theism would cash it out that way, but I think something along those lines is it. Let me put it this way. So here's a fun thought experiment. Yeah, so here's a fun thought experiment. What do you think is more important to God? That God be good and that God be righteous, or that God knows how many angels can dance upon the head of a pin? Which one of those is more important, do you think, to God?
I'd say his
I guess
goodness.
it's a pretty bizarre question.
No, like, come on, like, work it out, right? Which one of these is like, if you had asked God, hey God, which one of these things is more important? Do you care more about when it comes to your character? That you can know how many angels can dance upon the head of a pin, or that you're morally good, you're righteous, you're just? Which one of those do you think is more important to him?
Yeah. If you frame it as like, which one does he care more about? Surely. Yeah. Like, his goodness. Yeah.
Okay, so now we're rolling, right? Because now this is getting at the idea of like God, because your question is like, okay, listen, we've got, omniscience, we've got goodness, like why can this be given up and not this? But we've already agreed collectively that God cares more about his goodness than he does about just these mere, chunks of knowledge about how many angels can dance upon the head of a pin. So like one of these things is more important or more foundational, or even if we want to go with Adam's language, more essential. Like it seems like we all just agreed upon that.
Yeah, one is essential and one's not. But that's what I'm saying is like that would make the other one non-essential. In this case, though, we want to say that God is essentially omniscient and omnipotent, right?
Depending on how those things are defined, yeah. But you get
what about what I was saying about the scripture, right? Because if God can get rid of his goodness, then he can contradict the scriptures, because then he could flood the earth again, right? Like I think that's an important part of this too, is because he's covenantal in his love. Like he's made covenants, he's made promises, and so if he were able to give up his goodness, then he could flood the earth again and he could contradict the Bible. And so I think that your thought experiment is like, basically the conclusion would be God can contradict the scriptures, and I think we'd all want to reject that.
I think actually Nathan's pressing on a good point here. I think I should let Nathan cook a bit. Okay, so let me see if I can strengthen Nathan's argument. So Hebrews gives us the idea, or let me maybe see if I'm understanding Nathan's position correctly. So Hebrews gives us the idea that God guaranteed something by making a promise to Abraham, right? So Scripture gives us that idea. What Nathan seems like he's saying is like, listen, if God can give up his goodness, then it's wrong that God guaranteed anything to Abraham, right?
Exactly.
But we know that God did guarantee something to Abraham, so we know God can't give up his goodness. Like we could set this up as like I think it's modus tollens or something like that. I think that's a pretty good argument. I think that's really similar to what I do in my book. So yeah, I think Nathan is on the right path here. Of if you think that God can give up his goodness, it's going to entail that God didn't guarantee anything to Abraham. And so if you wanna affirm the truth that God guaranteed something to Abraham, which is something in Scripture, and I'm not gonna bash anybody if they like don't hold to infallibility or inerrancy. Like that's not a can of worms I'm going to open here. But if somebody does want to affirm those things, I think what I'm trying
to show is that it actually is a logical contradiction to give up his goodness, but it's not a logical contradiction to give up his knowledge. I think that's what I'm getting at here.
Okay, but here, I want to press something too. So I know we're piling on Adam. So like the Mullins in me, I think maybe is coming out, right? Okay, so like, if let's say X is morally perfect, right? If X gives up, well, how do I phrase this? I don't think a morally perfect person could ever give up their moral perfection, because to give up moral perfection is itself an immoral act. And a morally perfect person can't do an immoral act. Do you see where I'm going?
And it's a liability, not a
Yeah. So it's the idea here. It's like, so let's say X is morally perfect, right? In order for X to give up his moral perfection, X has to make the decision to give up his perfections. Like he has performed this act of giving it up. But the act of giving up moral perfection, that is itself something that's immoral. And if X is morally perfect, he can't do an immoral act. So then it's just like, it's not logically possible for him to do that in virtue of him being morally perfect. How are you, Adam?
That's what I'm getting at. Is it actually is a logical contradiction to get rid of his goodness. Like that would actually be a contradiction. But it seems to me like it's not a great making property, I guess you could say, necessarily, like simpliciter to know all propositions. So for example, like if I learned something new today, that doesn't make me greater than I am right now. It could be something completely useless. Like let's say I learn, I don't know, how shoes are made or something. That doesn't make me inherently better than not knowing that proposition. One could just say it's more, valuable in some utilitarian sense or some pragmatic sense, but it doesn't actually make me more valuable. And so I think when we want to define God as like the greatest conceivable being, it actually doesn't form a contradiction to say like he has promised to limit his power, but to let go of his goodness would actually entail a contradiction.
So I think that, well, I'm going to use the meanest version. I think that what you said last is false, Nathan. So you said, like, I think that if God limited his power or limited his knowledge, like that, wouldn't make him any less. So here would be my question then. Can the Trinity forget that they are God?
Is that to Nathan or to all of us?
Yeah, to Nathan. I don't know. Let's go with Nathan first. I'll pick on Nathan first. He's the one that spoke last. So,
so can the Trinity forget that they are God?
Mm-hmm. Can they limit their knowledge and say that we don't know that we're God anymore?
So I think if I were to go with James's route in the book, they are essential attributes of God, but not all of God's parts. And so maybe I could say like part of God.
I know, but I'm saying all of the parts though, right? So we can't the whole.
Well, I would say the whole thing. No, all of God can't do that. No, I would say that would be impossible.
Did you want to respond to that, James?
I think it depends on if you think doing that would constitute something immoral. Yeah. So this is
right.
kind of yeah. So this is gonna be one of those things. Like again, this is something that if you're finding this conversation interesting, free on Amazon. Just gonna continually plug the book. That a lot of these ideas we're talking about here are things that come up in the book. So I'm just gonna shamelessly plug it free.
The book is free on Amazon, but we are free on YouTube. So.
That's true, and you get citations and the appeal of scholarliness in my book, which you're not getting here as we're all just giggling.
Can I add one more point to what I said?
Yeah, go for it.
So I think the important thing to note is that when Jesus is limiting himself, he's doing it in the context of a covenant, and so I think the context is really important. That the context it shouldn't be removed from what's going on. So like if we were to say like in a vacuum, can God do this? I would probably want to say no. But like what Jesus is doing is he's redeeming mankind. He has a purpose behind it, right? He's not doing this action in a vacuum. And so he's doing it out of his love and out of his care for mankind and out of care for creation, and to disbar Satan to pull on your your last work. And so I think that a lot of times when we talk about these conversations, I don't want to think about these questions in a vacuum. I think it's important to think what context would come about where God would need to do that? What covenantal context would need to come about where God would need to do that? And I don't think there is one. So I don't think it will ever happen.
Adam, can I ask you, when you ask this question, I get the feeling that you're setting up a trap. And so what I want to do is I want to spring the trap, right? I want to spring the
James,
trap. And
I think it's official. We're officially friends.
Me and you? Yeah, nice. All right, so here's what I think. I think you're setting up a trap. And so because here's what I'm thinking in my head is like, okay, well, if I say, so you give me an option, can God do X? And what I'm thinking of is like, well, if I say yes, what comes from that? If I say no, what comes from that? I imagine if you're saying this, you're probably thinking, oh, if they say this, I've got them. All right. So what do you think is if I say, do you want to tease out the implications of if I say yes or no? Either one is.
Yeah. So let me get to like way down the line and stuff. To me, the bottom line is that it seems like, one, Kenotic Christology can only work in a Trinitarian framework. Like, I think this is the only way that this works. Like, it just cannot work on any other model. It can't work on a Unitarian model. It can't work on a modalist model. None of those other things can account for this and stuff. And so, like, I think that, like, even the whole idea of talking about Jesus being incarnate in the way that we're talking about it
Mhm.
is only possible in this framework. Because I do think that if you want to talk about, okay, Jesus is God, right? Jesus is God. And it's like, okay, cool. Jesus is God. And it's like, okay, yeah, but the Father's God and all that other stuff. Yeah, let's leave the predications and all the little nuances there and stuff like that. But if you say like, it's like, okay, can God limit his knowledge? Right. And it's like, there's only a certain degree to which that's true. Because I think that if you say that all of God completely limits his power to, like I said, there can be levels to which if you limited his knowledge or power to too great an extent, it would be immoral for God to do so. So, for example, like if God limited his knowledge and forgot that he was God, then there would be no one to adjudicate justice and stuff like that across the universe. In which case, that would be wrong. It would be immoral. And so I think that those are, like, to me, some of the major things that, like, this only can work in a universe in which somebody is still adjudicating, they're still managing all those things. And so I guess I would think of it in the sense of, I don't know, I don't have a great analogy, but it's the idea, like, okay, there's a guardhouse and Jesus can leave the guardhouse and go do other things only because there still is somebody back at the shop managing and taking care of the universe.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm okay with
I'm
someone
cool with
who
that.
wants to take that route. Yeah.
I'm totally cool with that.
Now,
I think the Trinity is necessarily
let me
true.
make the let me make the last logical connection as to why bother explaining all of that, right?
Mhm.
Because when we're talking about, okay, what's essential, right? The Trinitarian aspect would be essential, like, because most of the time we're focused on just Christology,
Yeah.
and so, and you're like, well, what's essential to God? Really, in that sense, we're actually thinking of the entire Trinity to some degree,
Yeah, I think.
right? So we can't just limit it to Jesus.
Oh, okay, wait. Okay. I think I might see the issue. Okay. Oh, an issue. So I think most people would, or at least like Trinity or Trinity monotheists, I would say that um, being Trinitarian is an essential attribute to God as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think that's an essential attribute to being divine. In fact, this is one of the things that comes up, and I think I talk about in my book, because this is the type of objection that comes up with Craig, and like objections to his view of the Trinity, where someone's going to want to say, like, okay, listen, a property of like the divine nature is being triune. But like, oh well, Jesus isn't triune. Does that mean Jesus isn't exemplifying the divine nature? Like stuff like that. So I think most Christians are going to want to say, like, God is essentially triune. Like, I think it'd be really weird to be like, God's triune, but like contingently, like the Son and Spirit, they didn't have to be there. Like, or God, there could be 8. There could be 8 people. God was just like, 3. That's a good number. I like that one. I think like saying like the triuneness of God is like contingent is like a weird take. So I wouldn't want to say that. So I would agree with like that's essential to God. But when we say that's essential to God or an essential attribute of God, I would just want to clarify that in that moment, the God that's being referenced there is like this being as a whole. That's not something that's essential to like every like person in it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I would agree with that. I think the Trinity is essentially true. I think in all possible worlds, God is triune. Like I would want to posit that. I think that is that's what makes God's lovingness complete. That's what makes God. Essentially, he can have one-on-one relationships, communal relationships. Like this is what completes God as God. I think that like a binitarian or Unitarian or multi-personal, like more persons would be superfluous, which as I believe it's Josh Rasmussen, he says like God has no arbitrary limits. Right. So if you had like 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 people, that would be an arbitrary limit where you could ask why that many. But I think with 3, it's not arbitrary. Like there's actually a perfectly rational reason for it to be 3, and not 2 or 1 or more. But then also, again, I think I really want to go back to the covenant context, because I'm with R.T. Mullins on the fact that God's perfection is perfect rationality. And so the reason that Jesus needed to do this is because of the covenant context of humanity had fallen. We're in a fallen state. We're under the dominion of Satan. Like Satan's ruling the world. The powers of this world are ruling the world. And what we needed was a human representative to conquer sin, to conquer death, and to overthrow the powers of darkness so that we could join into covenant relationship with Yahweh, because that's what he wants. And so the reason Jesus is emptying himself is within a context. It's not in a vacuum. And so I'm trying to also ask, like, in what context could God even need to empty himself of all of his knowledge? Right? Like, I think that because if we're wanting God to be perfectly rational, there needs to be a context in which God would need to do that. And so it seems to me, Adam, for your objection to get off the ground, you would need to provide some sort of context in which God would need to do such a thing. And if you can't, then it almost feels like it doesn't matter. Does that make sense?
Let me frame this question. Okay, so James did a good job of explaining the idea of God's omnipotence, and it's like, okay, God can limit his omnipotence, right? So we see this idea of like God limits his omnipotence through his promises, and it's like, okay, cool. So God decided, like, hey, I'm no longer going to flood the world. Okay, cool. And then he uses that to kind of show, like, okay, well, then why can't God do the same thing with his knowledge? And so, in a way, this is what I want. This is what I want to know. Like, the omnibenevolence, God's goodness, would be the inverse. You're saying, like, okay, here's omniscience in the middle, right? God can do it because the omnipotence helps shows us how he can limit his knowledge. Well, now, in a sense, I'm saying, like, on the other side, it's like, okay, but here's his goodness. Why can't you limit his goodness? If you can limit his omnipotence, you can limit his knowledge, then why can't you limit his goodness? And your guys' response seemed to be like, well, no, that's because it's an essential attribute, right? And it's like, okay, cool. So then it seems to me his goodness is not essential.
No, my answer was because it would entail a contradiction with the scriptures. That was my answer. That removing his goodness would actually mean that he could contradict his promise to not flood the earth. And so that actually is impossible, but it's not impossible for him to limit his knowledge. And so I think that was my answer, is that it actually is a logical impossibility to limit his goodness.
Yeah, I want to point out that I gave, I think, a pretty interesting argument earlier that we haven't talked about. And so, like, since this is back up again, I'm going to press it. Okay, Adam, so let's say I have a morally perfect being. Let's say Bob is morally perfect. Don't you think, like,
Go, Bob.
it would be... Yeah, don't you think it would be immoral to, like, give up moral perfection? Like, doesn't that seem like if you're morally perfect, like, don't you think it's immoral to give that away and then be able to, like, do bad things? Like, don't you think it'd be morally better to, like, retain moral perfection and then that way never, like, have the possibility of bringing about evil? Like, doesn't that seem, like, intuitively plausible?
Yeah,
I mean,
describes that as a liability, not a power. Yeah.
Yeah. I think so, but I mean, like, okay. Let's use like a scripture verse.
Wait, because now you sprung my trap card, right? Because now what I'm going to say is, like, even outside of Kenotic Christology and things like that, I'm just going to say, if we agree on that it's immoral to give up, give away moral perfection, then it's just logically impossible. Like, it's not possible for a morally perfect being to give up moral perfection. Like, because doing so, we just agreed, would be immoral. So, like, it's just logically impossible to give that up. So for a morally perfect being to give up moral perfection, that's logically impossible. I think we've come to that. The question is there something logically impossible about an omniscient being giving up knowledge? And I don't think you can show a logical contradiction in the way that I just did with moral goodness. Because whereas giving up moral goodness, giving up moral goodness implies, I think that very act is something that's not good. Giving up, a chunk of knowledge, that act in itself isn't inconsistent with the person originally having the knowledge. You know what I mean? Like, there's not that contradiction there.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's not that one is more essential than the other, like, is what you're trying to say. You're trying to say, well, it seems like you're saying moral goodness is essential and these others aren't essential. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying it is logically possible to give up these, and it's not logically possible to give up moral goodness.
I think
I'm not sure.
Yeah, go ahead. I think the argument I just gave is a banger. I'm interested in hearing Adam's response to it. Yeah.
Yeah, there's lots of stuff. So like one, like I'm not sure. No, I've got like a few different questions here. Let's see which way to go. Okay, so one, I do think like, isn't it a logical contradiction to forget something if you're omniscient?
Well, I don't think so.
And if you promise to forget it, then no.
Yeah, so let's take Bob. Okay, yeah, so let's do it this way. Let's just use like a really simple definition of omniscience. Like, let's just not even talk about like that definition too. Let's just go with something really. X is omniscient. Bob is omniscient if Bob knows all truths. Okay, so let's say Bob, he's great. He knows all true propositions. Let's say Bob makes the decision he's like, oh man, I've got all these true propositions, and there's a lot of them, and I just don't want these anymore, and he gives them up, right? That idea in and of itself, like there doesn't seem to be any type of logical contradiction in that idea, right? Like, would you agree? Like, just in the idea of Bob being like, I've got all these true propositions. I know I'm tired of thinking about them. Like, I just want to, I want to chill out for a bit. And so if he gives them away, there's nothing logically impossible of like this being who knows all these true things, like getting rid of some of them. There's nothing logically impossible there, right?
So then he no longer knows them, right?
So let's just keep it simple. So in that scenario, Bob would no longer be omniscient. So let's just Bob's
Yes.
like, I'm just okay. So that's logically possible for Bob to do that.
Yes.
Okay, but it seems like I think we agreed that same scenario isn't true with goodness, because it's not logically possible for a morally good person to give up their moral perfection. So then whether or not like Bob retains omniscience or not, like regardless, like let's just say like we're talking about just getting rid of it in general. Like there is a disconnect where like an omniscient person can give up their omniscience, and that's not logically incoherent. Where it seems to me like it is logically incoherent to say a morally perfect person gives up their moral perfection. So there does seem to be this disconnect.
And in the covenant context, because again, I don't like talking about this purely in a vacuum.
You will remember the covenant. You will remember the covenantal context.
Yes, because I think talking about this stuff in a vacuum usually doesn't do any good, because Hebrews tells us that Jesus did this so that he could be a merciful high priest. So like there's something in alignment with his perfect rationality and his perfect goodness that makes something like if Kenotic Christology is true, this emptying to be the case. He needed to do this. It was actually in alignment with his goodness and love to make a promise like this, where he would empty his omniscience and omnipotence. And if there is no logical contradiction there, then the covenant context, it seems, if Kenotic Christology is true, that was an essential thing he had to do. It's almost like he had an obligation to do it if that was like what was required. Now I know that some people don't like arguing that God has obligations, but I think he does. So yeah.
So here's one of the last ones we'll go with, because I know we'll be running out of time and stuff. But can a morally perfect person be tempted by evil?
I've put out several videos on this. So I've put out several videos on this talking about like what does it mean to be tempted and things along those lines. So I'm going to be like, for a second, I'm going to like shamelessly plug my channel and say go look at my channel where I have some of these videos that I've put up. I think I'm morally perfect, and this is an area where admittedly a lot of people, even theologians, are going to be like, James is whack. I think that it's possible for a morally. So so I know Nathan doesn't like to consider things in a vacuum, but I actually think that it's good sometimes to consider things in a vacuum, because like if you can take away like the messy things and like all these other variables, maybe you can just like find some good principles. Okay, so Nathan, are you married?
No.
Okay, whatever. We're all men here, right?
Yep.
Fun thought experiment. You're walking down the street. Out of the corner of your eye, you get a glimpse of a beautiful woman in a short skirt or something like that, right? Like, so like there's a beautiful, you just passing by, you see it, right? In that moment, you're tempted to look, right? You're tempted to like look with lustful intent, right? In that moment, when you have that temptation, you have that like that draw, like, no, I want to look over there. And now let's say that you had that temptation, but like you're a good Christian and you didn't do it, and you just eyes up front soldier and you keep going about your way, right? In that moment, did you sin? Let's collectively ask that. Did you sin in that moment? I don't think you did. I think if you're walking, you're like, it's there, I want to, I'm not going to do it. Jesus said, don't, I'm going to keep walking. I don't think you sinned. Can we agree on that?
Yeah. I think we didn't. And yeah, by the way, I'm cool with thinking about stuff in a vacuum, but I think when we're specifically talking about what God can and can't do, I do think the context is important. But yeah, anyways.
Gotcha. Adam, what do you think? Will you agree there's no sin in that context that I gave?
Relatively, yeah, sure. For the sake of all argument, sure.
Well, then it seems like we're in agreement, gentlemen, that like feeling that inner draw or feeling that inner temptation is not itself immoral. If that's not a sin, then that means a morally perfect being. Like, there's nothing in contradiction with saying a morally perfect being can experience that same thing we experienced when we were walking down the street. Like, there's no contradiction there. Yeah.
So hypothetically, perhaps, but if God is not tempted, why isn't God tempted but Jesus tempted?
On the are you thinking about like why are you thinking about that section from, I think it's James, about God not being tempted? And
Sure.
yeah, so I did a video on this idea not too long ago. So I think there's a couple different things. So here's an idea, right? Here's an idea. You could say that God's not tempted because, like, the Father's not tempted because Jesus has limited his cognitive abilities in such a way. So you could think that a person who has like non-limited cognitive abilities, like they're just never going to even have that draw or desire. So you may think it has to do with that. Like, you may think the temptation has to do with and this is something I think even outside of a canonic context, some people would probably talk about. Some people would want to argue that, like, listen, like if you knew everything, you're not even going to feel the draw to sin. Like, for instance, right now you and I, we probably don't feel much of a draw to like stick our hand in a running blender. Like, that's not something we're itching to do, because we know about, the consequences of that, so on and so forth. So one thing I could say is like, okay, well, Jesus has taken on cognitive limitations in his knowledge, which allows evil to be tempting. So that's one way I could go about it. Another thing that so there's several different options here. Another way you could say that you could go about it is that the temptation that is felt, that has to do with us being like embodied on this earth and like spirits messing with us. So there's this idea in scripture of like Satan tempts married men, trying to get them to like commit adultery so he can slander us or something. That's an idea in scripture. I forget the verse, but there's this idea of like the temptations and stuff like that we feel like there are evil spirits behind it. It was like, okay, well, if Jesus is here, like, hanging out with us, and those spirits are like attacking him and afflicting him as well, and like trying to get him to do stuff, like, well, the Father in heaven, I don't think they're like taking swings at like the Father on his throne. So maybe there's a difference there. Let's see, what else do I have? I think those are two good ones. I mean, maybe you could say like part of it has to do with things about just being embodied in general. So I gave the example of lust a while ago. Like, if the Father isn't like embodied and like has testosterone and stuff and things like that, like, I don't think he's going to be like experiencing like the same like phenomenological like draw that someone like Jesus would be in like a human body. So yeah, those are like two or three like rough options that I think are pretty plausible for why like the Father in heaven may not be able to be tempted by sin, but like a canonic Christ could be.
Also, there is an idea. Well, there's also a book called "Tempted for Us" by John McKinley that argues that Jesus was actually tempted. So that's an interesting resource if someone else wants to pick that up. But also, there's this idea in philosophy of religion called like omnisubjectivity. And I know that not everyone holds to this, but the idea is basically that God actually has, like, you could almost say, direct acquaintance with all of our subjective feelings, right? So God actually knows what it's like for us to be tempted, because he's directly acquainted with our experiences. Now, I know that there are objections to that and things like that, but that is one potential option as well. That is one way that God has experiential knowledge of our suffering and of our temptations and things like that.
I just thought of another potential answer for mine. So listen, if you hold to eternal generation, then you could go this way. If you hold to eternal generation, like, if you're like, listen, if the Father is the ground for the Son, the Father can maybe with the Son's permission or whatever, the Father can tweak some of the parameters of like what the Son feels and things like that. The Father could not generate whatever it is that is prevents the Son from being tempted. So you could you could connect that property with something that's part of the generation process. I don't think I hold to eternal generation, so this isn't going to be like the well that I go to. But if you hold to eternal generation, then I think like the idea of like, well, why is it that Jesus can be limited but not the Father? Or we could be like, as someone who holds to eternal generation, they're like, well, like the Father is like the one grounding everything, and like he grounds Jesus, and so like he can kind of maybe withhold from grounding some knowledge or something like that. You can have some fun with that, but that's as someone who I don't think I hold to eternal generation. I give that freely to those who can enjoy it. I give that option freely to those who can enjoy it because I don't think I can.
Did you have anything else, Adam?
I mean, there's plenty of stuff you could talk about, but I don't know. I think it's a good portion of things and stuff.
Can I ask you something, Adam? So most of the stuff
Yeah.
you've talked about has been regarding my second strategy. Do you have any objections with the first strategy?
Well, part of the point of bringing up some of those notions is just to say, like, well, I don't know how essential are some of those things, and so like you ground again this idea, like, well, the promises can be okay. So this was one of the ones that we talked about a little bit, right? So you ground the idea that like, well, he could have the loss of his omnipotence and his omniscience based on his promises, right?
But the promise is, yeah, but that's part of the second. I'm asking you, do you have objections to the first thing?
I think his objection to the first one was that it only works on Trinitarianism. Like it can't work on Unitarianism or modalism. Yeah.
Well, it's that in combination that I do feel like it's to me, I feel like it. And like some of this would just have to be like, I haven't done all the work to try and work out the logic, but it seems much more logically plausible that, this leans towards the idea that those are not essential attributes. Well, actually, so here would have been my other question, right? Is that you say like, well, the only thing that's essential is that Jesus is divine. So I'm just not exactly sure. Well, I think the next question is like, well, what is essential to being divine? And you're saying, well, just to be a member of the Trinity. Okay, but does that mean that a member of the Trinity can be simply divine, but impotent in every other way?
Well, I would
that
say
doesn't seem right. So
yeah, but I would say yeah. So I would say if a person is a member of the Trinity, then in virtue of being a member of the Trinity, they're divine, even if they are, even if they're as impotent as you and I are. Yeah. So that's my position, is that even if Christ comes down and he is just as powerless as you and I are, in virtue of being a member of the Trinity, he would still be could be called God. Yeah.
Yeah. So that just makes it interesting. And so in which case, again, like only in the Trinitarian sense do these things work, right?
Yeah, it's explicitly grounded in a specific model of the Trinity. Yeah. So yeah, it's of course it only works under a Trinitarian model. Yeah, it's the Trinity strategy. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I'm not saying that. Yeah, like I know I'm asking a lot of questions, but
I'm into it, man. I'm glad you're fun. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, Del Tuggy, you can't employ this. Del Tuggy, you can't use this argument.
That is true. I'm well. Yeah, Dale doesn't have a problem with Kenotic Christology. He doesn't have that view at all. So, yeah. I do like Dale though, but I think that
he would have a problem with
some people
Christology for the opposite reason. Yeah. Because it says that Christ was this stuff. Yeah, he was, pre-existent and all that. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
Does he think?
I was a little surprised,
or does he think Jesus? No. So he thinks Jesus was just born.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, I would have even more issues with his view then. I didn't know that he denied the pre-existence. I thought he was more like Arian, like the Father created Christ, and then through that, because like Colossians, through the Son all things were created. So I thought you at least have to go there, but he doesn't even affirm that.
Nope. Yep.
Wow.
That's why I'm like, listen, people bash, like, or I see Christians critique like a Jehovah's Witness, or like like the historical Arian view of Christ or whatever. Like, that's way more respectable than like the nonsense that guys like Dale holds to. Like, at least Jehovah's Witnesses affirm pre-existence and things like that when it comes to Jesus. Like, Yeah, there is a whole lot. I've been working on a Christology project, and just the number of verses you just have to do your gymnastics out of in order to get away from the pre-existence of Christ. It's a whole lot.
Have you read what is it, Matthew Bates' book Salvation by Allegiance Alone?
I read some of it. He also, I think, recently came out with a book called The End of the Salvation Wars or something like that. And I was actually thinking about
Yeah.
picking it up because his view on like the allegiance stuff, I've heard Heiser talk about that, and I've read some, not all, I don't even know if most, but I've like flipped through some of Bates' book, and some of what I've seen, I'm pretty on board, and that's generally tends to be how I talk about like faith now. But yeah, I should I know that some people on the more evangelical side of the spectrum are getting upset with Matthew Bates. Like some people with like the Gospel Coalition, like their website, they've put out some video or some like post critiquing Bates. But from what I've heard of Bates, it sounds kind of based. I don't know. Like, yeah, I'm pretty into
I'm basically with him on his thesis. So the reason I brought him up though is because I'm actually currently reading his book, and in the chapter I read literally this morning, before I went to bed, he talks about some arguments for pre-existence. So I just wanted to let you know that was in there if you're working on something like that.
Should. Thank you. Thank you for telling me that, because like I think it was as I was laying in bed the other night. Like there are some books I'm not going to read when I'm going to bed because I know I need to like take notes and like stuff like that. But like, sometimes I just I was thinking about picking that up. So that's it. So that's the Allegiance Alone one that he talks about that.
Yeah, Salvation by Allegiance Alone. It's not like a super long section, but he gives some arguments, and I can even just tell you what they are, so you don't have to buy the book. Like maybe offline, I can just shoot you his arguments. That way you can have those. But
after we go off, just summarize them for me, because I think I have access to that book for free. I have access to a lot of free books through my the place I did my university, like their online theological library. Saves me a lot of money. And so I might be able to just hop on and see what was see what was there with that. Yeah. Thanks for bringing that.
Yeah, there's one of his arguments, I'll just tell you, is like when Jesus says like I was sent, like I was sent to the earth. It's like that kind of presupposes like he existed before he came, right? Like stuff like that. So
Simon Gathercole has a whole book about I think it's called The Pre-Existent Son, and he goes to that well. And I'm not overwhelmingly persuaded. So I'm when I've been doing my Christology stuff, I'm trying to be going to what I view as the cream of the crop of some of these arguments. And I'm I don't know about the sent language thing. I mean other things are strong. I'm just not sold on that position. I wonder if he's drawing from Gathercole on that.
He does mention Gathercole's work, but he wasn't completely quoting it or anything. But he was talking about the pre-existence of the Son and stuff like that, and he used that argument, but he wasn't. He didn't rest his whole case on that. He had a few other little pieces of language Christ uses where it's oh, that's pretty interesting. Christ seemed to be fairly aware that he pre-existed his own birth. So yeah, like I said, I can email you some of his arguments and see which ones you find good and not.
Nice.
We're coming close on 2 hours, guys. So do we have anything else we want to talk about, or do we think we have hit a good spot here?
I don't know if I've mentioned it or not, but my book is free on Amazon.
I will put a link.
I don't know. I've emptied myself of that knowledge about whether or not I've mentioned that or not.
I'll put a link in the description below to Adam's channel, to James's channel, and to his book as well, since we've been talking about it this whole time. Guys, thank you so much for coming on. Adam, once again, could you tell the people where to find you, and then James as well?
Curious Christianity on YouTube. Also on X at Curie_Christian.
My name is right here. It's this. If you type this into YouTube, you'll get my YouTube channel. I do have a TikTok, which I very rarely use anymore. But I did do a live stream on it the other day, and maybe I'll do more live streams if I feel like I hate myself. Because that's the mental place you have to be in to do a TikTok live stream, maybe. Yeah, so I have my YouTube in Philosopher's Garb, and I'm just all over the place on the things I post. And I also have my 2 books, which if you go to my Amazon author page, you'll be able to find my other one. Working on another book on Christology. Don't know when it'll be done, but I think it's going to be pretty great. And yeah. I like these guys. This is the second time I've been on with Nathan. I think this is like the 8th time I've done something with Adam at this point. I think it's the 8th time I've done something with Adam. I'm exaggerating, but I've done quite a bit with Adam. Yeah.
Here's his other book, The Devil's Disbarment.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed that one as well. I was like, I know it's on my bookshelf somewhere.
That made the shelf too.
Yeah, it's like behind my shoulder though, so it's hard to see. But yeah, it's down there.
I see.
Yeah.
You hide it. No, I'm kidding.
It's in the shame section.
Oh yeah.
Actually, you know what? It's funny. I actually, that book that was a paradigm shifting book for me. I'll just say, because I was raised in PSA, and I believed that pretty much my whole life. And then as I read through it, you as well as I bought Will Hess's book, Crushing the Serpent's Head, and then I read a couple other things. I watched a few videos, and I think your view because it dealt with Isaiah 53 so in depth. I think it was just really powerful stuff, and the specific contributions on the divine council was really, I thought, was probably the coolest contribution of your view, is just the idea that there's this advocacy motif with Christ, and then there's the accusation motif of Satan and the divine council, and how all this comes together. I think it takes in all the biblical data better than any other view that I've seen. So just
thank you.
For that.
Man, you just keep buttering me up like that. I'll come back anytime. You guys know how to. You guys know how to make sure I come back. Just keep on giving me praise. No, thank you. I appreciate that. That's kind.
Yeah, I really do love your work. I watch all your videos. But speaking of which, your last video was crazy. We'll have to talk about that one off air. But yeah, that was something. But yeah, for all those that are watching, thank you guys so much for hanging out with us. Go follow all their channels, subscribe, all that great stuff, do all the YouTube things, and we will see you guys in the next one.
Bye. Do the princess wave.
Yeah.